Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of New Orleans. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know how far these documented stories reach and at what times of the day or night they are being heard. In the autumn of 1850, when the city of New Orleans had reached the pinnacle of its antebellum prosperity, a strange occurrence at the LaRue mansion on Esplanade Avenue near Chartres Street cast a shadow that would haunt the city for generations to come. The LaRue family home stood as a testament to wealth acquired through the business of human trafficking, a three-story Greek revival structure with Italianate elements that dominated its corner lot with imposing columns and ornate ironwork balconies. The house represented the pinnacle of New Orleans architecture, a visual manifestation of power in a city built on cotton, sugar, and slave labor. Samuel LaRue was not a native of Louisiana. He had come from Virginia in 1838, recognizing that the growing demand for slaves in the Deep South presented a lucrative opportunity. By 1850, he had established himself as one of the most successful slave traders in New Orleans, operating out of an office on Gravier Street in what had become the city's bustling slave trading district. His wife, Caroline Bennett LaRue, was the daughter of a wealthy Charleston merchant who had brought a substantial dowry to their marriage. The couple had 3 children, 2 sons, William and James, and a daughter, Elizabeth. But it was Harriet LaRue, Samuel's younger sister, who had joined the household in 1846, who would become the central figure in what newspapers of the day would later call the most bizarre disappearance in New Orleans history. Harriet had arrived from Richmond, Virginia, following the death of their parents, and had initially been welcomed as a governess for the LaRue children. According to household staff testimonies recorded years later, Harriet was an educated woman of 26 years when she arrived, with refined manners, but a peculiar intensity in her gaze that made many uncomfortable. In the carefully documented records of the St. Louis parish, which survive to this day in the historic New Orleans collection, there exists an unusual notation beside the name Harriet LaRue. While most entries in the parish registry simply recorded births, deaths, and marriages, the entry for Harriet contains a cryptic note. Removed from earthly concerns through means unknown, October 11, 1850. May God have mercy. This sparse ecclesiastical record would be the only official acknowledgement of Harriet's disappearance for nearly 2 decades. The story of what happened at the LaRue mansion on that October evening has been pieced together from fragmentary sources, household ledgers, personal correspondence, newspaper accounts, and court documents that emerged during a lengthy legal battle over the LaRue estate in the 1860s. These documents, many of which are housed today in the New Orleans notarial archives, paint a picture of a household in turmoil and a woman who may have discovered too much. According to household accounts, the evening of October 10th had begun with what appeared to be a typical formal dinner party. The LaRues had invited several prominent merchants and their wives, many of whom were business associates in the slave trade. As was customary, Harriet had overseen the preparations, directing the household slaves in arranging the dining room and ensuring that all was in perfect order. Amelia Wilson, the wife of one of Samuel's business partners, would later recall in a letter to her sister that Harriet had seemed uncommonly distracted that evening, excusing herself repeatedly during dinner and speaking little. What we know with certainty is that sometime after the guests departed, around 11 in the evening, a heated argument erupted between Harriet and her brother. This fact is corroborated by multiple witness accounts from household slaves who were interviewed years later by investigators working for the Metropolitan Police. According to these testimonies, The argument began in Samuel's study and concerned certain financial records that Harriet had discovered while organizing household papers. Martha Washington, a house slave who had been with the family since their arrival in New Orleans, gave the most detailed account of what transpired next. In a sworn statement recorded in 1867, Martha described how the argument grew increasingly volatile, with Harriet accusing her brother of crimes beyond the pale of Christian forgiveness. Martha reported that she had been instructed to prepare Harriet's room for the night, but had lingered outside the study door, concerned by the unusual vehemence of the confrontation. According to Martha's account, Samuel had eventually ordered his sister to retire to her room, threatening to have her committed to an asylum if she persisted in her delusional accusations. Harriet had reportedly responded that she would see justice done, even if it meant bringing ruin to the LaRue name. Martha then described hearing Harriet ascend the stairs to her third-floor bedroom, followed shortly thereafter by Samuel, who instructed Martha to bring a pot of tea to Harriet's room in 30 minutes' time. When Martha delivered the tea as instructed, she found the bedroom door ajar and the room empty. Harriet's bed was undisturbed, and her evening clothes were laid out as if in preparation for retiring. Nothing in the room suggested a hasty departure. Harriet's jewelry box remained untouched on the dressing table, containing several valuable pieces given to her by her late parents. Her traveling valise remained in the wardrobe. The only item conspicuously absent was a leather-bound journal that Martha knew Harriet to keep by her bedside. Martha immediately informed Samuel of his sister's absence. According to her testimony, his reaction was strangely subdued. He instructed her to check the rest of the house, but forbade her from alerting anyone outside the household. No search was conducted that night. By morning, when Harriet had still not reappeared, Samuel informed his wife and children that Harriet had decided to return to Virginia and had left in the night to avoid an emotional farewell. He claimed to have arranged transportation for her and provided funds for the journey. For nearly a week, the household maintained this fiction. Caroline LaRue would later admit, in a deposition given during the estate proceedings, that she had found her husband's explanation implausible, but had not questioned it out of what she described as wifely deference. It was only when an expected letter from Harriet announcing her safe arrival in Richmond failed to materialize that Caroline began to press her husband for the truth. The absence of Harriet LaRue might have remained a private family matter had it not been for the unexpected death of Samuel LaRue less than a month later. On November 7, 1850, Samuel was found dead in his office on Gravier Street, apparently having suffered an apoplectic fit. His sudden demise at the age of 42 years caused a minor sensation in New Orleans business circles, where he had been known as a man of robust health and calculated temperament. The settlement of Samuel's estate brought the question of Harriet's whereabouts into sharper focus. His will, dated 1849, had included a provision for his sister, leaving her a modest annual income and the use of a small property on the outskirts of Richmond. When the executor, a fellow slave trader named Jonathan Hayes, attempted to locate Harriet to inform her of this bequest, the inconsistencies in the story of her departure began to surface. No passenger matching Harriet's description had boarded any of the steamboats departing New Orleans on the night of October 10th or the following morning. No stagecoach service had carried her northward. The captain of the coastal vessel that Samuel had claimed to have arranged for Harriet's passage had no record or recollection of such a passenger. It was as if Harriet LaRue had simply vanished from the face of the earth. Caroline LaRue, now widowed and responsible for her 3 children and the family business, maintained the story that her sister-in-law had returned to Virginia. But in private correspondence with her own sister in Boston, portions of which survive in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, she expressed growing concern about the circumstances of Harriet's departure and her husband's subsequent death. In one letter dated January 1851, she wrote, "I cannot shake the feeling that Samuel carried a terrible secret to his grave, one that may yet cast its shadow over us all." The mystery might have remained buried had it not been for the curiosity of a journalist named Thomas Pierce. Working for the New Orleans Daily Crescent, Pierce had reported on Samuel LaRue's death and the significant estate he had left behind. Something about the family's account of Harriet's departure had struck him as suspicious, particularly given the timing of her disappearance so shortly before her brother's death. In March of 1851, Pierce published the first of a series of articles examining the strange circumstances, titled "The Vanishing of Miss LaRue." The piece recounted what was publicly known about Harriet's disappearance and raised pointed questions about the family's evolving explanations. Pierce noted that Caroline LaRue had initially told friends that Harriet had left to care for an ailing relative in Virginia, but when pressed for details, had reverted to the claim that Harriet simply wished to return to her former home. Pierce's investigation took a significant turn when he located a former slave from the LaRue household named Daniel Robinson, who had been sold to a plantation in St. Charles Parish shortly after Harriet's disappearance. Robinson, who had worked primarily in the stables and garden of the LaRue property, claimed to have witnessed something unusual on the night Harriet vanished. According to Robinson's account, as recorded in Pierce's article, he had been returning to the slave quarters after completing an evening errand when he observed unusual activity near the garden shed at the rear of the property. In the dim light of a lantern, he had seen Samuel LaRue and another man, whom he identified as Jeremiah Wilson, Samuel's business partner, carrying what appeared to be a heavy trunk from the house to a waiting carriage. Robinson stated that he had concealed himself behind a magnolia tree, fearing punishment for being out of the quarters after hours, and had heard LaRue instruct the carriage driver to make for the bayou and wait for further instructions. Robinson's testimony caused a minor sensation in New Orleans society. Jeremiah Wilson publicly denied any involvement, threatening legal action against the newspaper for defamation. Caroline LaRue retreated further from public view, refusing to comment on the allegations. The city authorities, heavily influenced by the commercial interests that profited from the slave trade, showed little inclination to investigate the matter thoroughly. The story might have faded from public consciousness had it not been for a macabre discovery made in December of 1852. A surveying party working along Bayou St. John, approximately 4 miles from the LaRue residence, unearthed human remains while assessing land for a proposed canal extension. The skeletal remains were determined to be those of a woman, with fragments of what appeared to be a fine linen nightdress still clinging to the bones. The city coroner, Dr. T. Francis Hackett, conducted an examination and concluded that the woman had been dead for not less than 1 year and possibly as many as 3. More significantly, he noted evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, indicating that death had resulted from violence inflicted by person or persons unknown. The discovery reignited interest in the LaRue case. Thomas Pierce, who had continued to investigate the disappearance intermittently, published a bold article suggesting that the remains might be those of Harriet LaRue. He called for a formal inquest and a reopening of the investigation into Samuel LaRue's business affairs, hinting that Harriet's disappearance might be linked to financial irregularities or other criminal activity. Caroline LaRue, who had by this time sold the family home on Esplanade Avenue and relocated with her children to a smaller residence in the Garden District, responded through her attorney. She categorically denied any connection between the remains and her sister-in-law, reiterating that Harriet had returned to Virginia. She provided as evidence a letter purportedly written by Harriet from Richmond, dated January 1851, in which she expressed contentment with her return to her childhood home. Graphologists of the period, examining the letter at Pierce's request, expressed doubts about its authenticity. The handwriting, while similar to surviving examples of Harriet's script, showed what one expert described as unnatural hesitation and inconsistency in the formation of certain characters. More damning was the revelation that the paper on which the letter was written bore a manufacturer's watermark that had not been in use until April 1851, 3 months after the letter's supposed composition. Despite these inconsistencies, official interest in the case remained lukewarm. New Orleans in the 1850s was experiencing unprecedented economic growth, driven largely by the cotton and sugar industries and the slave trade that supported them. The city's commercial and political elite, many of whom had ties to the LaRue family through business or social connections, seemed reluctant to pursue a matter that might cast a shadow over one of their own. It was not until 1859, nearly 9 years after Harriet's disappearance, that a significant breakthrough occurred. Construction workers excavating the foundation for an expansion of the St. Louis Hotel, which housed one of the city's most notorious slave auction blocks, discovered a leather-bound journal wedged within a wall cavity. The journal, water-damaged but largely legible, bore the name Harriet LaRue on its inside cover. The journal found its way into the hands of Edouard Blanchard, a clerk in the office of the city's chief of police. Recognizing its potential significance, Blanchard contacted Thomas Pierce, who by then had advanced to the position of editor at the Daily Crescent. Together, they examined the journal's contents, which proved to be both revealing and disturbing. The journal entries, spanning from Harriet's arrival in New Orleans in 1846 to October 9, 1850, the day before her disappearance, documented her growing horror at her brother's business practices. While Harriet had been aware of Samuel's involvement in the slave trade, the journal revealed that she had only gradually come to understand the full extent of his operations. Particularly disturbing were entries from September 1850, in which Harriet described discovering financial records suggesting that Samuel and his business partners were engaged in the illegal importation of slaves from Africa. The international slave trade had been prohibited in the United States since 1808, but Harriet's journal indicated that Samuel was part of a consortium that continued to bring enslaved Africans into Louisiana through an elaborate system of coastal transfers and falsified documentation. The final entry, dated October 9th, stated, "I have confronted Samuel with what I know. He denied all at first, then attempted to justify his actions as mere business. When I threatened to take what I have learned to the authorities, his manner changed entirely. I saw in his eyes a coldness I have never before witnessed. I fear what may come, but I cannot remain silent in the face of such iniquity. I will speak with Mr. Hayes tomorrow and lay before him the evidence I have gathered. God give me strength." The discovery of the journal provided a compelling motive for Harriet's disappearance and presumed murder. It also implicated not just Samuel LaRue, but potentially several other prominent New Orleans businessmen in criminal activity. Pierce published a careful account of the journal's contents, omitting specific names beyond those of the LaRues, while the authorities reviewed the evidence. The response was swift and unexpected. The offices of the Daily Crescent were vandalized the night after the article appeared. Thomas Pierce was accosted by unknown assailants while walking home and warned to leave the past buried. Most alarmingly, Edouard Blanchard was found dead in his lodgings, apparently having taken his own life, though no note was discovered, and friends reported that he had been in good spirits in the days preceding his death. The journal itself disappeared from police custody, officially recorded as misplaced during inventory. The investigation into Harriet LaRue's disappearance was formally closed in January 1860, with no charges filed and no official determination as to her fate. The city stood on the brink of the Civil War, and matters of a decade past held little interest for authorities consumed with the growing sectional crisis. Caroline LaRue, who had maintained her innocence throughout the intermittent investigations, died of yellow fever during the epidemic of 1853. Her children were raised by relatives in Charleston and inherited their father's considerable estate upon reaching majority. The LaRue business interests, including several slave pens and auction houses, were liquidated in the years before the Civil War, the proceeds invested in Confederate bonds that would ultimately prove worthless. The LaRue mansion on Esplanade Avenue passed through several owners in the years following Caroline's departure. By 1867, it had been converted into a boarding house catering to merchants and travelers with business in the nearby French Quarter. It was in this capacity that the house gained a reputation for being haunted, with residents reporting strange sounds emanating from the third floor, particularly from the room that had once belonged to Harriet LaRue. Frederick Schmidt, a German immigrant who operated the boarding house from 1867 to 1872, kept a meticulous log of these occurrences. His records, preserved in the city archives, describe the sound of a woman weeping, footsteps pacing in an empty room, and most disturbingly, the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. Several guests refused to stay in the third-floor rooms, and at least one, a cotton broker from Memphis, departed in the middle of the night, claiming to have seen a woman in a nightdress standing at the foot of the bed, her face a mask of terror. In 1871, a former slave named Martha Washington, by then an elderly woman living in the Treme neighborhood, came forward with additional information about the night of Harriet's disappearance. In a statement given to a Freedmen's Bureau agent investigating claims of pre-war crimes against both enslaved and free people, Martha revealed that she had not told the whole truth in her earlier testimony. According to this new account, Martha had actually entered Harriet's room while delivering the tea and had found Samuel LaRue there, standing over a trunk. She claimed that she had seen what appeared to be a woman's hand protruding from beneath the trunk's lid before Samuel ordered her from the room. Terrified, she had retreated to the kitchen and had not spoken of what she had witnessed until now, nearly 21 years later, fearing retribution even after Samuel's death. Martha's revised testimony was recorded but never acted upon officially. She died the following winter, her death noticed only by members of her church congregation. The agent who had taken her statement was reassigned to Mississippi shortly thereafter, and her file was archived with thousands of others as the Reconstruction era gave way to the period historians would later term redemption, marked by the reassertion of white supremacist control throughout the former Confederacy. The LaRue case might have remained just another unsolved mystery in a city filled with them had it not been for an unusual discovery made during renovations to the old mansion in 1894. Workers removing a section of flooring in what had once been Harriet's bedroom found a small cache of items concealed in the space between the floorboards and the ceiling of the room below. A cameo brooch, a folded piece of paper containing a lock of dark hair, and a small key. The owner of the property at that time, a retired physician named William Grant, recognized the potential historical significance of the items and donated them to the Louisiana Historical Society. The brooch was identified through comparison with a portrait of Harriet LaRue that had survived in the possession of distant relatives in Virginia, as one she had often worn. The key remained an enigma, fitting no known lock in the house. It was the piece of paper, however, that proved most intriguing. When carefully unfolded by a curator at the Historical Society, it revealed itself to be not merely a wrapper for the lock of hair, but a hastily written note. The ink had faded considerably, but under proper lighting the text became legible. Should I be silenced, know that the evidence lies within the hidden compartment of the escritoire. They traffic not merely in those born to bondage, but in souls stolen from Africa's shores. The profits from this illegal trade have corrupted half the merchants in New Orleans and at least 3 officials in the customs house. God forgive them, for I cannot. The note was unsigned, but graphologists comparing it to known examples of Harriet's handwriting concluded that it was almost certainly hers. The escritoire, referenced in the note, was presumed to be a writing desk that had been among Harriet's possessions. Its whereabouts, however, remained unknown, having been sold or otherwise disposed of, along with most of the LaRue household furnishings, following Caroline's departure from the Esplanade Avenue house. In 1909, an article appeared in the Times-Picayune titled "The LaRue Mystery Revisited," written by a journalist named Edward Collins. Collins had become fascinated by the case after discovering Thomas Pierce's original articles while researching another story. His investigation led him to a curious footnote in the case, a notation in the records of the Bank of Louisiana indicating that Samuel LaRue had made an unusually large cash withdrawal on the day of Harriet's disappearance, amounting to $5,000, a substantial sum in 1850. Collins also uncovered correspondence between Samuel LaRue and Jeremiah Wilson, dating from 1849 to 1850, that contained veiled references to a special cargo arriving from our friends across the water. Given the context and the period, these were almost certainly references to the illegal importation of enslaved Africans. The letters, which had been part of Wilson's business records seized during the Union occupation of New Orleans, had been filed away in the National Archives, overlooked by previous investigators. Most significantly, Collins located the daughter of Daniel Robinson, the former LaRue slave who had claimed to have witnessed unusual activity on the night of Harriet's disappearance. Anna Robinson Bradford, who operated a small dressmaking business in the Tremé district, shared additional details that her father had related to her before his death in 1884. According to Anna, her father had actually followed the carriage that departed from the LaRue property that night. Keeping to the shadows and maintaining a discreet distance, he had tracked it not to Bayou St. John, as had been reported, but to a small wharf on Lake Pontchartrain. There, the trunk had been transferred to a waiting boat, which had immediately set out across the lake. Daniel Robinson, unable to follow further and fearful of being discovered, had returned to the LaRue property, only to be sold to a plantation in St. Charles Parish the following day, an act he had always believed was meant to remove a potential witness. Collins' article reignited interest in the LaRue case, but it also stirred resistance. He received anonymous threats warning him to let sleeping dogs lie, and the newspaper's editor reported pressure from several prominent New Orleans families to discontinue the series. After the 3rd installment, the articles abruptly ceased, with the newspaper citing space constraints as the reason for their termination. The final significant development in the LaRue mystery came in 1927, when an elderly man named Thomas Wilson, the son of Jeremiah Wilson, approached the Louisiana Historical Society with what he claimed was his father's deathbed confession, recorded in a letter addressed to Thomas but never mailed. The letter, dated August 1869, contained a detailed account of the events of October 10th and 11th, 1850. According to Wilson's letter, Harriet LaRue had indeed discovered evidence of his and Samuel's involvement in the illegal slave trade. On the evening of October 10th, following the dinner party, she had confronted Samuel with this knowledge and threatened to expose the operation to federal authorities. In a panic, Samuel had summoned Wilson to the house. Upon arrival, Wilson found Samuel in Harriet's bedroom. She had been rendered unconscious, though whether by violence or drug tea, the letter did not specify. Together, the two men had placed her body in a trunk, which they then transported by carriage to a prearranged meeting point on Lake Pontchartrain. There, they had transferred the trunk to a small vessel captained by a man known to them only as Frenchie, a smuggler who had previously assisted in their illicit operations. The boat had taken them to the far shore of Lake Pontchartrain, where Harriet's body was buried in an unmarked grave. The letter did not clarify whether Harriet had been dead or merely unconscious when placed in the trunk, leaving ambiguous the direct cause of her death. Wilson expressed profound remorse for his role in the affair, writing that, "The face of Miss LaRue has haunted my dreams these 19 years, her eyes wide with the knowledge of our betrayal." The letter concluded with a reference to Samuel LaRue's death less than a month after Harriet's disappearance. While the official cause had been recorded as an apoplectic fit, Wilson's account suggested something more sinister. He wrote, "Samuel's nerve broke entirely in the weeks following. He became convinced that Harriet's spirit was pursuing him, claiming to see her standing at the foot of his bed at night or glimpsing her on the street, only to find no one there when he looked again. In his final days, he spoke of making amends, of confessing all. I could not allow this, for his confession would have been mine as well. The arsenic was easily obtained and administered gradually over several days. The physicians, seeing a robust man suddenly taken ill, never suspected foul play." The authenticity of the Wilson letter has been debated by historians in the decades since its discovery. Some have questioned why Jeremiah Wilson would have composed but not sent such a self-incriminating document even to his son. Others have pointed out inconsistencies in certain details when compared to known facts of the case. Yet the letter aligns with much of what is independently known about Harriet LaRue's disappearance, and provides explanations for elements that had previously been mysterious. The LaRue mansion on Esplanade Avenue was demolished in 1938 to make way for a commercial development. Witnesses to the demolition reported that workers uncovered a small chamber concealed behind a false wall in what had once been Samuel LaRue's study. The space contained a writing desk, presumably the escritoire mentioned in Harriet's note, but if any documents had once been hidden within it, they were long gone by the time of its discovery. The desk itself was claimed by the property developer and subsequently lost to history. The site where Harriet LaRue was presumably buried has never been definitively identified. The eastern shore of Lake Pontchartrain has undergone significant development since the mid-19th century, and any unmarked grave from that period would likely have been built over or otherwise obscured by now. The skeletal remains discovered along Bayou St. John in 1852, once thought to possibly be those of Harriet, were interred in an unmarked grave in St. Louis Cemetery No. 2 after the coroner's examination concluded. Yet the story of Harriet LaRue continues to resonate, particularly in a city like New Orleans, where the past often seems more palpably present than in other American cities. Tour guides in the French Quarter sometimes include the LaRue case in their narratives of the city's darker history, though the details have often been embellished over the years, conflated with other historical incidents or local legends. What remains undisputed is that Harriet LaRue disappeared on the night of October 10, 1850, and was never seen again. The most plausible explanation, supported by the preponderance of historical evidence, is that she was murdered to prevent her from exposing her brother's involvement in the illegal slave trade. The subsequent deaths, Samuel LaRue, Edouard Blanchard, and possibly others, suggest a conspiracy that extended beyond a single act of violence to an orchestrated cover-up involving multiple individuals with vested interests in maintaining the secrets of the New Orleans slave trade. The story of Harriet LaRue serves as a grim reminder of the far-reaching moral compromises that upheld the institution of slavery in antebellum America. It illustrates how the economic interests built upon human bondage corrupted not only those directly involved in the trade, but also the broader systems of justice and governance that might otherwise have held them accountable. In the silencing of Harriet LaRue, we can discern the silencing of countless other voices that sought to challenge the prevailing order of their time. The LaRue mansion is long gone, its physical presence erased from the New Orleans landscape. Yet in archives and historical records, in fading newspaper accounts and the oral traditions passed down through generations, the mystery of what happened on that October night continues to haunt our collective memory, a spectral presence that, like so many aspects of America's troubled past, refuses to remain buried. Some long-time residents of the area where the mansion once stood claim that on particularly still October nights, when the air hangs heavy with humidity and the sounds of the city seem momentarily hushed, one can hear the faint sound of a woman weeping. Others report glimpsing from the corner of their eye the figure of a woman in 19th-century dress who vanishes when directly confronted. These may be merely the embellishments of a city that has always had a complex relationship with its dead, or they may be something more, echoes of a justice long delayed and perhaps never fully realized. The most bizarre slave mystery in New Orleans history, then, is not merely a tale of one woman's disappearance, but a window into the moral abyss that was the American slave trade, a system so corrupt that it would silence even those within its own privileged circles who dared to speak against it. As the city of New Orleans continues to grapple with its complex past, the story of Harriet LaRue remains a haunting reminder that history is not merely what we choose to commemorate, but also what we have tried to forget. The uncomfortable truths that persist despite our efforts to silence them, the voices that continue to speak from beyond the grave, demanding that we listen, that we remember, that we acknowledge the full measure of our shared heritage in all its beauty and its horror. In the fate of Harriet LaRue, we confront not only the historical reality of a specific crime, but the broader crime against humanity that made such individual acts of violence not merely possible, but inevitable. In the end, perhaps the most fitting memorial to Harriet LaRue is not a physical monument, but the continued telling of her story, an act of remembrance that honors her courage in confronting the evils of her time and acknowledges the ultimate price she paid for that courage. In a city where the past is never truly past, Harriet LaRue's spirit endures, a testament to the enduring power of truth in the face of those who would suppress it, no matter the cost.